Hello everyone, good day. Welcome to my class in Anatomy and Physiology as I will discuss to you the cell transport mechanism in relation to the previous topic on the introduction to cell physiology. Before I will deeply discuss the process of cell transport mechanism that includes both the active and passive processes, it would be very important to know first the property of your plasma membrane. Okay, when we say plasma membrane serve as the outer boundary of your cell. Your plasma membrane is also called as your cell membrane or your plasma lemma. Take note, it is what we call your plasma lemma. About your plasma lemma or your cell membrane or your plasma membrane, since I mentioned it is the outer boundary of the cell, it is also a selective barrier that controls which substances enter and leave the cell. The transport of the materials or substances across the plasma membrane is essential to a life of a cell. The certain substances move into the cell to support metabolic reactions. It also implies that the ability of the cells to exist and to maintain their life-sustaining activities is largely dependent upon the ability to take in and get rid of certain substances. Again, it is largely dependent upon the ability to take in and get rid of certain substances. And the failure to carry out these activities will cause the cell to die, or it will cause the death of the cell. Again, it leads to the death of the cell, failure of that activities. That is why it is very important to know how the substances move into and out of the cell. Now, what is that property that I mentioned earlier that we need to understand? That property specifically, that is your permeability. It is the property of your plasma membrane or your cell membrane that determines precisely which substances can enter or leave the cytoplasm. As you can see the picture here, this is what we call your fluid mosaic model. Again, your fluid mosaic model. This model describes the arrangement of different molecules in your cell membrane or your plasma membrane. As you can see here, that there is a phospholipid bilayer. Actually, the size of your plasma membrane, it ranges from 7.5 to 10 nanometers. It is so thin that it could hardly be noticed under the light microscope. However, the modern electron microscope shows that the cell membrane consists of a double layer of fats. As I said, that double layer of fats is what we call your phospholipid bilayer. Again, when we say phospholipid bilayer, it is called phospholipid bilayer because it is a lipid with a phosphate group. When we say lipids, this includes your fats and also your cholesterol. When we say lipids, one of the building blocks are your, guess what? That is your fatty acids and your glycerol. On the other side of your model, the fluid mosaic model, we have here the non-polar region and your polar region of the phospholipid molecules. What is these regions that I mentioned? Actually, the polar, the phosphate containing ends of the phospholipids are hydrophilic. When we say hydrophilic, again, the polar regions are said to be hydrophilic. It means to say they are water-loving, and therefore face the water inside and outside of the cell. While on the other hand, the non-polar or the fatty acid ends of the phospholipids are said to be hydrophobic. What do you mean by hydrophobic? It means to say they are water-fearing and therefore face away from the water on the either side of the membrane. Again, facing the water on the either side of the membrane toward the center of the double layer of your phospholipids. Actually, the double layer of your phospholipids forms a lipid barrier between the inside and the outside of the cell. Now, there are three terms that we need also to understand in relation to the property of your plasma membrane, which I mentioned, your permeability. First term is what we call your impermeable. When we say impermeable, it is a membrane through which nothing can pass. That is why we call impermeable. So, hindi lahat talaga nakakapasok sa cell membrane. The second one is what we call your freely permeable. Ano naman ibig sabihin ng freely permeable? When I say freely permeable, it is a membrane through which any substances can pass without difficulty. That is why they can pass without difficulty, because it is also one of the factors that they can pass without difficulty it is because of their sizes. The smaller the molecules can also freely pass through inside and outside of the cell, or inside and outside by the means of your cell membrane. That is what we call freely permeable. How about selectively permeable? Actually, when we say selectively permeable, this is actually the property of your plasma membrane. The plasma membrane, take note, is said to be selectively permeable. It means to say it permits the free passage of some materials and restrict the passage of others. Ibig sabihin, merong mga certain molecules or substances na pwede siyang makapasok, and there are also others na hindi siya po pwede makapasok. It is because of their one of the factors there is the size of the molecules. So there are certain, so it means that there is a restriction. There is a restriction of the substances that which can enter the cell through the means of your plasma membrane. Again, there is a restriction. So hindi lahat nakakapasok. Okay? Hindi lahat nakakapasok ng mga molecules. So those are the things that we need to understand. That is the selectively permeable membrane of your cell membrane, or also called as your plasma lemma, or also called as your plasma membrane. Take note of that, selectively permeable. Now we need also to differentiate what do we mean by active and passive transport. It is because the question there is, how do substances such as your nutrients or waste products get across the plasma membrane without damaging it? So that is the question that we need to understand. Actually, that is what we call your transport processes. So again, the answer to that question, it lies on the property of your plasma membrane, that is your permeability. But in terms of the two processes involved in the transport of the substances into and outside of the cell, we have only two broad categories. That is what we call your active and passive transport. So we need to understand what is the difference between the two. So I will play a simple video that will give us the distinction between active and passive transport.
Cell transport is the process of how things move in or out of the cell through the cell membrane. There are two broad categories of cell transport. The first category is passive transport. For a cell, passive transport means it's an automatic process that doesn't require any input of energy. For example, diffusion is a passive process in which particles move either into or out of the cell from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. The cell doesn't use any energy when this happens. The second category of cell transport is active transport. This is when particles move from an area of lower concentration to an area of higher concentration. When particles move against the concentration gradient, energy is required, often to allow protein pumps to assist in particle movement. Why would the cell need to move particles from a low to high concentration and expend energy to do it? An important example is seen in your heart muscle cells. In order for your heart to beat, there are certain molecules that have to move from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration for those cardiac muscle cells to work. So the main things to remember are: passive transport happens automatically with no energy required, while active transport needs energy for it to occur.
Now that you know the difference between the active and passive transport mechanism, now we must have also to determine what are those substances that can pass through the cell membrane. Okay, we have your oxygen, carbon dioxide, steroids, fatty acids, nitrogen gases, and also your fat-soluble vitamins. These fat-soluble vitamins are your ADEC, your vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, and vitamin K. On the other hand, there are also small uncharged polar molecules that can also pass through the plasma membrane. It is because of their small molecular structure. Actually, they are non-lipid soluble: water, urea, and alcohol. While on the other hand, from oxygen to fat-soluble vitamins, they are said to be soluble in lipids. Again, they are lipid soluble. Again, why I need to emphasize the lipid soluble substances? It is because, as I mentioned, that your plasma membrane, based on the fluid mosaic model, there is what we call a phospholipid bilayer. Since they are composed of a lipid structure, then most of the substances that are said to be soluble in lipids, then they can also easily pass through the plasma membrane compared to those substances that are not lipid soluble. Now, we need to understand also your passive processes. Okay, your passive process, as I mentioned earlier and based on the video I played, these are processes that does not require cell to expend energy. So there is no energy expenditure at all. So what are the basic example of your passive process or processes, or a passive transport mechanism? Your passive process is also called as your, guess what? That is your physical process. These are your diffusion, osmosis, facilitated diffusion, and also your filtration. That is your DOF. Now, in this part, I need to discuss first the diffusion. Okay, what is diffusion? Diffusion is a movement of molecules, particles, or substances. Again, it is a movement of molecules, particles, or substances from an area of greater concentration towards an area of a lesser concentration. So from greater concentration or from high concentration to a low concentration or to a lesser concentration. Take for example your potassium permanganate that is dissolved in water solution. Again, your molecules, particles, and substances, they are said to be classified as your solute. Those solutes are your substances or particles or molecules that are dissolved in a certain solvent. Example of your solvent, that is your water. Here is my video animation about the illustration of your diffusion. As you can observe, the substance, the potassium permanganate that will serve as your solute, is spreading evenly. Okay, the molecules of your potassium permanganate is now covering the whole area. So the movement is that from the area of greater concentration or higher concentration, then it moves to an area towards a low concentration. So that is your diffusion. Now, another example that best illustrates your diffusion is your sugar cube. Your sugar cube. Okay, your sugar cube, actually, the dissolving sugar cube, as you can see from image 1, image 2, image 3 to image 4, there's a sugar cube here. The dissolving sugar cube is placed in the water, and as you can notice, it slowly disappears as the sugar molecules dissolve and diffuse from the region or the area where they are more concentrated towards the region or the area where they are less concentrated, and eventually the sugar molecules distributed evenly throughout the water. So, napapansin niyo yung mga molecules ng sugar cube, dahan-dahan siya na nagsispread even. Okay? So, the diffusion stops based on the image number 4. So, bakit siya nagsastop yung diffusion? Where does it stop? It stops when the molecules of a certain substances, such as for example, your sugar cube molecule is being distributed evenly, or kaya na-balance na yung pagsispread ng mga molecules ng isang substance. So again, if there is a even distribution of the molecular substances, or it is said to be balanced, then doon na siya nagsastop yung diffusion. There's a term that we need to understand, like the statement movement down the concentration agent, movement with the concentration agent, or movement along the concentration gradient. What do you mean by that? If you can hear those statements, when we say movement down with or along the concentration gradient, it means to say that the movement of your molecules is from higher concentration or greater concentration towards the area of a lower or lesser concentration. So that is what we mean by those terms like movement down with or along the concentration gradient. But by the way, what is concentration gradient? Actually, concentration gradient, simply, it is the difference between the high and low concentration. Against the difference from the movement between high to the low concentration is what we call your concentration gradient. Actually, the diffusion happens or occurs because the molecules have a free energy, that is, they are always in motion. So when we say they are always in motion, that specific energy is also called as your kinetic energy. That is why they are moving passively from, they are moving randomly. There is a spontaneous movement from higher concentration to the area of lower concentration. Other terms that would also reflect that movement is the movement when I say the sugar cube moves down the concentration gradient. It is also the same thing when I say it moves from higher to lower concentration. Even if I say that the movement of your sugar cube molecule moves with or along with the concentration gradient, so it means to say, all in all, they mean the same thing. They move from high to low concentration. So that is the simple or the basic principle of your diffusion. In terms of your diffusion, as one of the example of your passive mechanism or passive transport processes, there are certain factors that we need to consider. So what are those factors that can affect the diffusion process? Number one is your temperature. Why temperature is one of the factors? It is because the higher the temperature, the faster the rate of the diffusion. That is why a particular substance is when a particular substance is being dissolved in a warmer solution or in a solvent, suspended in a solvent, the diffusion process takes much faster compared to the solution that is said to be cold, in a colder solution. So that is why if the temperature is much higher, then there is a faster rate of the diffusion. And take note, all of the body's diffusion processes occur more rapidly, especially in a person with a fever. Take for example your fever. There is an increasing temperature, so it means to say when there is increasing temperature inside in our body, so most of the diffusion processes that are happening also inside in our body cells, there is also a faster rate of diffusion. So that is the explanation of your temperature as one of the factor of your diffusion process. Second is your molecule size. Why the size of the molecules is one of the factor? Again, it is because the smaller the molecule size, the faster the rate of the diffusion. Example, the ions and the small organic molecules such as your glucose, they diffuse more rapidly compared to those larger proteins. That is why those larger proteins cannot easily pass through the plasma membrane. I mean the plasma membrane, one of the property of your plasma membrane is being a selectively permeable membrane. So hindi lahat nakakapasok. It is because we need to consider also the size of the particular molecule. Next is your distance or the diffusion distance. Okay, the greater the distance over which the diffusion must occur, the longer it takes. So that is why we need also to note that in the human body, few cells are farther than 25 micrometers. So ang layo niya ng mga those few cells. Actually, there are certain group of cells that are farther than about 25 micrometers from a blood vessel. So supposedly, kung malayo yung distance, so mas matagal din nangyayari yung diffusion. Actually, the diffusion across a plasma membrane takes only a fraction of a second because the membrane is very thin. Okay? But there are certain condition, or let's say for example diseases like your pneumonia. Okay, pneumonia. In a disease I mentioned, pneumonia, there is what we call a fluid collection also in the lungs. The fluid collection in the lungs will cause an additional problem about the diffusion process. The additional fluid increases the diffusion distance actually, because the oxygen must move through the built-up fluid. Nung nabubuo doon na fluid, syempre nakaharang yun. Isa yun sa mga humaharang sa diffusion process. And the oxygen, beyond moving through that built-up fluid, the oxygen also move into the membrane to reach the bloodstream. Yun naman yung direction talaga ng oxygen, from the higher concentration inside our lungs, specifically in the alveoli. Then the oxygen from that portion, they will move actually towards in our bloodstream. So now we need also to consider the electrical forces. Paano ba nakakaapekto yung electrical forces doon sa process ng diffusion? Okay, it is said to be that the opposite electrical charges, positive and negative charges, attract each other, and the like charges repel each other. So that is the basic principle. And bear in mind that the inner cytoplasmic surface of the plasma membrane has a net negative charge relative to the exterior surface. Sa madaling salita, yung outer part kasi ng ating cell na mas madami yung mga cations. Ano ba mga example ng mga cation? Cations are those ions that carry a positively charged particle. Example, the most abundant is your sodium ions. Sodium ions is located outside of the cell. On the inner part of the cell, it is said to be the negative. The environment is highly negative because of the presence of the ion also that influence the negativity of the environment inside the cell. If there is a cation, there is also a term anion. Anion is one of the ion that also carry a negatively charged particle, and that example again I mentioned that is your chloride ion as one of the example of your anion. So what is the relationship there to the diffusion process? Actually, since the positively charged ion example is your sodium, so the movement, if we apply the diffusion process, the principle of diffusion, the movement of the sodium ions is from higher concentration towards the lower concentration. So if we need to understand the movement, so it is from the outside because they are higher at the outside compared to the inside part of the cell. So from the outside going to the inside part of the cell. So the same thing processes that is happening if we apply the principle of your diffusion, again from higher concentration to the lower concentration. Next is your concentration gradient. It is simply because the steeper the concentration gradient, the faster the diffusion. Okay, again, much steeper the concentration gradient is, the faster the rate of your diffusion. Next is your surface area. The larger the membrane surface area available for diffusion, then the same thing, the faster also the diffusion rate. Example, the air sac of the lungs, also called as your alveoli, have a large surface area available for the diffusion of your oxygen that is taken from the air, and that is the direction is going into the blood. There are some instances such as diseases that can affect the lungs, which can also decrease the surface area. There are many diseases that can affect the surface area of our alveoli, that in turn it decreases its surface area. Thus, it slows also the diffusion rate of the oxygen and makes breathing more difficult. So that is the importance there, why there must be a diffusion happening in the alveoli going into our blood. So it must be the surface area must be larger so that the diffusion process can occur normally. So I think those are some of the concepts regarding your diffusion as one of the passive transport or a physical transport mechanism or of processes